Imagine a king vanishing before the eyes of thousands on the very day he was to wear his crown. What dark force could rip a ruler away in the middle of his own coronation? Tonight, we uncover the chilling mystery, the forbidden ritual, and the terrifying truth that history tried to bury. Stay with us and don't forget to subscribe, because the secrets hidden in the shadows of power are only just beginning. The story begins on a day that should have been remembered as one of the grandest celebrations in royal history. The streets were alive with color, decorated with banners, flowers, and the sound of trumpets. Citizens from far and wide had gathered in the capital to witness a moment that only came once in a lifetime. The coronation of their new king. It was a day of hope, pride, and tradition. But what no one could have predicted was that this very day would also become one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the kingdom. A day when the king, in front of his people, vanished without a trace. The morning sun had risen over the city, casting a golden light on the palace walls. The atmosphere was electric, as if the very air carried anticipation. Bakers had worked all night to prepare sweets for the people. Musicians were rehearsing their songs, and soldiers lined the streets, their armor gleaming in the sunlight. The great cathedral, where the coronation was to take place, was overflowing with nobles, priests, and envoys from neighboring lands. Everyone was waiting for the grand moment when the young monarch would step forward, kneel before the altar, and receive the crown that symbolized centuries of royal legacy. This king was not just any man. He was young, charismatic, and seen by many as a new hope for the nation. His childhood had been marked by both privilege and tragedy. His father, the former ruler, had died under suspicious circumstances that were still whispered about in the corners of taverns and among the servants of the court. Some believed it was illness, others suspected poisoning, but no one dared to speak too loudly. And now, the son was about to ascend the throne, inheriting not only power but also the heavy weight of secrets, enemies, and unfinished stories from the past. As the procession began, the streets erupted in cheers. The people reached out to touch the hem of his robe, to see the man who would become their king. He waved, smiled, and carried himself with the dignity expected of a monarch. But beneath his calm expression, some close to him noticed the flicker of unease in his eyes, as if he was carrying knowledge that no one else could see. Inside the cathedral, the ceremony was set to begin. The air was thick with incense, the glow of candles lit the stained glass windows, and the choir sang hymns that echoed across the vast hall. The king approached the altar, flanked by priests in heavy robes, embroidered with gold. The crown rested on a velvet cushion, a crown that had been worn by generations before him, and now it was his turn. The archbishop raised his voice, calling for silence, and the moment came. The young king knelt, the prayers began, and the crown was lifted high above his head. And then it happened. Before the crown could touch his hair, the king faltered, his body swayed, his eyes widened in shock, and he clutched his chest. Gasps filled the hall. Some thought he had fainted. Others rushed forward to help. But in an instant that no one could explain, his body seemed to blur, his form seemed to dissolve into shadow, and before anyone could take hold of him, he was gone. Gone. The hall erupted in chaos. Nobles shouted. Priests screamed. Soldiers ran to the altar. But the king was nowhere to be found. His robes lay crumpled on the ground, the place where he had knelt now empty. The crown remained in the archbishop's trembling hands, its weight suddenly unbearable. The people outside the cathedral, unaware of what had just happened, continued to cheer and sing, waiting for their king to emerge crowned. But inside, panic had set in. The unthinkable had occurred. The king had disappeared in the very moment of his coronation. The search began immediately. Guards stormed every corridor of the palace, every chamber, every cellar, but there was no trace. Witnesses swore they saw him vanish before their eyes, not walk away, not escape, but vanish. Some claimed it was witchcraft, others whispered of curses, and a few believed it was divine punishment. For centuries, the crown had been said to carry both power and danger, and now people wondered if the ancient warnings had finally come true. Outside, the truth could not be hidden for long. When the crowd realized the ceremony had stopped, confusion spread. The songs died down, and rumors began to ripple through the masses. The celebration turned into fear. What did it mean for a king to vanish before he was crowned? Was it a sign that the kingdom was cursed? Was the throne now empty, vulnerable to rivals and enemies? In the days that followed, the city was gripped by uncertainty. The council of nobles tried to calm the people, issuing statements that the king was safe and would return soon. But behind closed doors, they were terrified. Without a crowned monarch, the kingdom was leaderless. Neighboring rulers, sensing weakness, might strike at any moment. Factions within the court, those loyal to old families, began plotting to seize control. The queen mother wept in her chambers, refusing to speak, while servants whispered that she knew more than she let on. Whispers of darker theories began to spread. Some said the king had been taken by enemies who had infiltrated the cathedral, using forbidden magic. Others claimed he had staged his own disappearance, unwilling to rule a kingdom burdened with corruption and blood. And then there were those who believed he had not disappeared at all, but had been pulled into another realm, a place where the dead and the living touched, a realm tied to the crown itself. The crown, after all, had its own legend. It was said to be forged centuries ago, not only as a symbol of power but as a vessel of ancient magic. A king who wore it was bound to it, for better or worse. Some had risen to greatness, others had fallen into madness. And now, without a king to wear it, the crown sat locked away in the cathedral, watched by guards day and night, its golden surface glinting ominously in the candlelight dot. Weeks passed, then months, and still no sign of the missing king. Some believed he was dead. Others prayed for his miraculous return. His face was painted on walls, songs were sung in his memory, and yet no body was ever found, no explanation ever uncovered. The mystery only grew deeper, but beneath the silence, hidden in the archives of the palace and the whispered confessions of priests, there were clues. Letters written in the king's own hand hinted that he knew something was coming. Journal entries described his dreams, visions of shadows, voices calling his name, and a figure cloaked in darkness waiting for him at the altar. He had written, days before the coronation, that he feared not his enemies of flesh and blood, but something older, something tied to the throne itself. Could it be that he had not vanished by accident? Could it be that the coronation was a trap, that the moment the crown was lowered was the moment he was taken by the very force he had feared? And so, what should have been a day of joy became a day of haunting questions, questions that would echo for centuries. The disappearance of the king became legend, a story told to children, a warning to rulers, and a mystery that no historian, no priest, no scholar has ever solved. Some claim he will return, that he is merely sleeping, waiting for the time when the kingdom needs him most. Others say he is lost forever, a prisoner of the shadows. But one thing is certain. The king who disappeared in the middle of his own coronation left behind more than an empty throne. He left behind fear, suspicion, and a story so strange, so terrifying, that it would be remembered long after the banners faded, long after the songs ended, long after his name itself was forgotten. The days after the disappearance of the king were filled with disbelief and fear. People had witnessed many strange events in their lifetimes, wars, plagues, even omens in the sky, but nothing compared to what had happened inside the cathedral. A king had simply vanished before the crown touched his head, and no one could explain how. The kingdom had been thrown into chaos, and the very idea of leadership now hung in question. Who would rule if the chosen king was gone? And most importantly, where had he gone? The royal council immediately gathered in secret meetings, their faces grim, their words heavy with doubt. Some argued that the truth must never be spoken, that the people should be told the king was safe and recovering. Others said lies would only make the kingdom weaker, and the truth, however dark, should be revealed. But what was the truth? There was no body, no evidence, only the terrified testimonies of those who had been closest to him when he disappeared. The archbishop, who had been holding the crown, was pale and shaken. He swore he saw the king's form fade into shadow, as if pulled into a different realm. Priests debated whether this was a sign from God or a curse unleashed by dark magic. Nobles whispered about treachery, wondering if some powerful rival had orchestrated this disappearance to claim the throne. Soldiers scoured every inch of the cathedral, its tunnels, its crypts, even the hidden chambers long forgotten by history. Nothing. The king was gone, as if swallowed by the air itself. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, rumors grew wild. Some said the king had been taken by angels, lifted into heaven because he was too pure for the throne. Others claimed demons had dragged him into hell, punishment for sins known only to him. Merchants told stories in taverns about sorcerers casting spells on the crown, while old women in villages warned that the royal bloodline had been cursed centuries ago, and this was simply destiny. The disappearance became not just a tragedy, but a myth, reshaped with every telling. Yet behind the whispers and rumors, some clues began to surface, fragments of truth hidden in shadows. The king's personal chamber was searched, and among his possessions, the scribes found letters written in his hand. The words were uneasy, filled with dread. He had written of dreams that haunted him, standing in the cathedral, hearing a voice calling his name, seeing shadows where none should be, and feeling hands pulling him into darkness. These dreams, he said, came night after night as the coronation drew closer. More unsettling were his private notes about the crown itself. He had written that when he looked at it, he felt both drawn to it and repelled by it. He described it as if it were alive, heavy with something beyond gold and jewels. It is more than a crown, he had written. It watches me, it waits for me, and when it rests upon my head, I fear I will no longer be myself. When these writings were quietly read aloud to the council, silence filled the chamber. Some said it was the rambling of a nervous young man facing the weight of kingship. Others felt the words were a warning that the crown itself carried a curse, one that had finally claimed him. The crown, locked away after the disappearance, became an object of fear. Guards refused to touch it. Priests refused to bless it. Even the nobles, hungry for power, avoided it, as if placing it on one's head would mean sharing the same fate as the missing king. But one man dared to dig deeper. A royal historian named Alaric, old and half-blind, began searching the ancient archives for answers. He believed the crown's origins held the key, In dusty scrolls and faded manuscripts, he uncovered tales from centuries earlier, when the crown was first forged. It was said to be created not only as a symbol of power, but as a vessel to bind the will of the kingdom's gods. Those who wore it gained legitimacy in the eyes of the people, but they also bound themselves to forces beyond human control. Alaric found records of past kings who had suffered strange fates. One had gone mad, claiming he heard voices day and night. Another had died mysteriously on his coronation night, his body never found. A third had vanished during battle, leaving his soldiers leaderless. These stories had been buried, erased from the official chronicles, but Alaric realized they painted a chilling pattern. The crown had claimed rulers before. If this was true, then the young king's disappearance was not an isolated event but part of a curse stretching back generations. But if that was so, why had some kings lived long lives while others had fallen to it? What determined who survived the crown and who vanished into its shadow? Alaric tried to present his findings to the council, but they dismissed him as a superstitious fool. They wanted to maintain order, not spread panic with stories of cursed crowns. Yet quietly, some members of the council began to wonder if he was right. As weeks turned into months, the mystery only deepened. Sightings began to surface. People claimed they saw the king walking the streets at night, his face pale, his eyes distant, disappearing into the mist before anyone could approach. A shepherd swore he saw him standing on a hill, staring toward the city, before vanishing like smoke. Travelers reported hearing his voice in the wind, calling for help. Was the king alive, trapped between worlds, trying to return? Or were these visions nothing but fear and imagination? The people grew restless. Without a king, taxes were disputed, laws were ignored, and rival factions within the nobility schemed for power. Some called for the king's younger cousin to be crowned in his place, while others demanded the queen mother take the throne. But every time the crown was brought out, a strange unease filled the room. No one dared to touch it, let alone place it on their head. It sat in silence, glittering in the dim light, as if mocking them. Meanwhile, whispers began to spread that the disappearance was not magic, not a curse, but treachery. Some accused the archbishop, saying he had used the moment of coronation to perform a forbidden ritual. Others pointed fingers at the nobles who stood to gain the most from the king's absence. Poison, trickery, assassination. These theories grew louder in the taverns and markets. But those who had been inside the cathedral swore it was no trick of men. They had seen him vanish with their own eyes, as though swallowed by shadow. One night, Alaric the historian ventured into the cathedral alone. He wanted to see the crown again, to study it more closely. The guards, recognizing the old man, allowed him in. Under the flickering light of candles, he approached the relic. He stared at its jewels, each one said to represent the souls of kings past. And as he gazed, he felt the air grow heavy. The silence of the cathedral pressed on his ears. Then, faintly, he thought he heard a voice whisper. Lo, an ancient dot, it said his name. Alaric stumbled back, terrified, but the voice followed him. He swore he heard the king himself, begging for release. He ran from the cathedral, shaken and pale. When he told others what he had experienced, most dismissed him as mad. But some began to wonder, was the king trapped within the crown itself? Was his soul imprisoned, waiting for someone to free him? The legend of the missing king grew. Children were told to behave or the vanished king will take you. Priests warned that greed and ambition had angered the heavens, and the kingdom would never know peace until the mystery was resolved. The kingdom was slowly breaking apart under the weight of uncertainty. Without a king, it was vulnerable. Rival rulers began massing troops at the borders, sensing opportunity. Merchants feared to travel, peasants feared the future, and the once great capital seemed cloaked in permanent gloom. And yet, in the midst of all this, hope lingered. Some believed the king was not gone forever, that he would one day return to reclaim his throne. Prophecies began to spread of a day when the vanished king would step out of the shadows, wearing the crown at last, and lead the kingdom into a new age of greatness. But hope was not enough. Each passing day made his return less likely, and each passing day made the crown, still locked in the cathedral, more terrifying. For if the king was truly trapped within it, then perhaps anyone who dared to wear it would join him in that same prison. Vanishing into darkness, the kingdom waited, uncertain and fearful. And as night fell over the palace, the torches flickering on the walls, the great unanswered question remained. What truly happened to the king on the day of his coronation? The months stretched on, and with each passing day, the disappearance of the king weighed heavier on the kingdom. Fear, suspicion, and unrest became the rhythm of daily life. At first, the people had expected their monarch to return, perhaps with a miraculous explanation. But hope was slowly turning into despair. A nation could survive war, famine, and plague, but to lose its king in such a mysterious way was a wound that refused to heal. The council struggled to hold the realm together. Nobles began fighting among themselves, each seeing an opportunity to seize power. Armies that once marched in unity now stood in tension, their loyalty wavering. Farmers grew weary of paying taxes to a crown that had no head, and commoners whispered openly about rebellion. The kingdom was unraveling, thread by thread, as if the disappearance had broken not only the monarchy but the very soul of the nation. In the capital, the cathedral remained locked, guarded day and night. Inside it lay the crown, untouched, sealed in its case of gold and glass. To some, it was a sacred relic, the last symbol of authority. To others, it was a cursed object, a trap for any who dared to claim it. And yet, despite the fear it inspired, the crown called too many. Ambitious lords dreamt of placing it on their heads, of ruling in the king's absence. But each time one tried to make the attempt, something stopped them. The last noble who demanded the crown collapsed suddenly, his body shaking violently, blood seeping from his nose, before he fell lifeless to the floor. From that day on, no one dared to touch it again. Meanwhile, Alaric, the old historian, refused to give up his search for answers. He believed the crown was a prison, a gateway that had swallowed the king's soul. He searched forgotten scrolls, traveled to ruined monasteries, and spoke with hermits who had lived in caves for decades. Each story he collected added to the legend. Some spoke of a shadow realm, a place between life and death where souls could be trapped by powerful artifacts. Others told of an ancient order of priests who had forged such objects to bind kings to the will of the gods. Alaric began to believe that the king was not dead, but imprisoned, trapped in this realm, waiting to be freed. But if that was true, the question remained, how could he be brought back? The answer came from a forbidden manuscript found deep in the archives. It spoke of a ritual, dangerous and rarely attempted, that could open the veil between worlds, but it required a sacrifice not of gold or jewels, but of life. To bring back a soul bound by the crown, another must take his place. It was an exchange, a balance, a cruel law of fate. Alaric was horrified. Could he condemn another life to save the king? Could he even trust the ritual, when failure might unleash something far worse? He wrestled with the choice, but as the kingdom descended further into chaos, he realized that desperate times might demand desperate actions. While Alaric searched for answers, shadows gathered in the kingdom. A secret society began to rise, calling themselves the Keepers of the Crown. They believed the disappearance was no accident but part of a divine plan. The king, they said, had been taken to the realm of spirits to purge the sins of his ancestors, and when he returned, he would be more powerful than ever. They began recruiting followers in villages and towns, promising that loyalty to them would guarantee blessings when the king came back. Their influence spread quickly, and soon they became a power of their own, challenging the authority of the council and sowing further division. The queen mother, desperate to protect the throne, tried to suppress them, but her soldiers were outnumbered. The kingdom was no longer one people under one crown. It was breaking into factions, those who believed the king would return, those who believed he was dead, and those who saw only opportunity in the chaos. But even as mortals fought, strange events continued to plague the land. In the forests near the capital, hunters spoke of seeing a figure in royal robes wandering among the trees. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, but his voice was unmistakable. It was the king. Villagers reported hearing his footsteps at night, echoing through empty streets. Some claimed he entered their dreams, speaking words they could not remember when they woke. One chilling account came from a young maid in the palace. She swore that as she polished the halls at night, she heard someone behind her. When she turned, she saw the king standing there, his face twisted in sorrow, his mouth opening as if to speak. But instead of words, only a long, hollow scream escaped him before he vanished into nothing. Stories like these filled the air with dread. Was the king's spirit trapped, struggling to return? Or had something darker taken his form? Alaric feared the latter. He knew that when a soul was bound to a cursed object, it could be corrupted, twisted by the darkness within. The king that returned might not be the king they remembered, but something else entirely. Yet still, he pressed forward. He prepared for the ritual, gathering the ingredients described in the manuscript: candles made from the fat of sacred animals, incense ground from rare herbs, and a dagger forged of silver and iron. But most important of all, he needed someone willing to offer their life. And who would agree to such a fate? The answer came unexpectedly. A young squire, devoted to the king since childhood, approached Alaric. He had served the monarch faithfully, and could not bear to see the kingdom fall apart. "If my death can bring him back," the boy said with steady eyes, "then my life is worth the sacrifice." Alaric hesitated, torn between admiration and guilt. But in the end, he agreed. The ritual was set for the night of the full moon, when the veil between worlds was said to be thinnest. That night, in the cathedral, the ritual began. Candles flickered against the stone walls, shadows danced in strange shapes, and the crown glowed faintly, as if alive. Alaric recited the ancient words, his voice trembling. The squire lay upon the altar, his chest rising and falling in nervous breaths. As the final chant was spoken, the air grew heavy. A wind rose within the cathedral, though no doors were open. The crown shook, its jewels glowing with an eerie light. Then, from the darkness, a figure began to form: the king, his face pale, his body flickering as though made of smoke. Alaric's heart raced. It was working. The king was returning. But the joy lasted only moments. the figure's face twisted, his eyes blackening, his voice a guttural growl. This was no king, it was something else. Something that had been waiting inside the crown for centuries. The squire screamed as the shadow reached for him, pulling at his life. Alaric shouted the final words of the ritual, forcing the exchange. Light filled the cathedral, blinding, searing, burning. When it faded, the squire's body was still, lifeless, and where he had lain stood the king, real, solid, breathing, but something in his eyes was wrong. The kingdom had its king again. But Alaric could not shake the fear that what had been brought back was not the same man who had vanished. And as the people cheered his return, as the bells rang across the city, a darkness lingered in the king's gaze, a darkness that promised the story was far from over. The kingdom roared with celebration at the return of its king. Bells tolled across villages, soldiers shouted in triumph, and the council fell to their knees, thanking the heavens for restoring their monarch. Crowds filled the streets, torches blazing as songs rose into the night sky. To the weary people, this was salvation. Their fears were silenced, their doubts washed away. The king had returned, and with him, so had hope. But Alaric, the historian who had led the ritual, did not share in the joy. As the cheers echoed around him, his eyes lingered on the king's face. Outwardly, the man looked the same strong jaw, the same noble bearing, the same crown resting upon his head. Yet his gaze was not the same. It was darker now, sharp and hollow, as though something ancient peered through those familiar eyes. Alaric alone seemed to notice it, and the weight of that truth settled heavily in his chest. At first, the king seemed eager to resume his role. He addressed the people with powerful words, promising to restore peace, unity, and strength. His voice carried over the crowds, commanding and proud, and the people wept with joy. But soon, small cracks began to appear. Those closest to him noticed first. Servants whispered of strange behaviors. The king would sit in his chambers for hours, staring at nothing, whispering to himself in words no one could understand. At night, his screams echoed through the palace, chilling the guards who stood outside his door. He ordered feasts at odd hours, demanding food he had never eaten before, raw meat, bitter herbs, strange wines that no one had tasted for centuries. Even more unsettling were his eyes. Whenever someone questioned him, they seemed to darken, as though shadows swirled within them. One minister who dared to challenge the king's decision collapsed suddenly at the council table, clutching his chest as if struck by an unseen hand. The others fell silent after that, too afraid to speak. Alaric's fears grew. He began to dig deeper into the texts he had studied, searching for answers. What if the ritual had not freed the king at all, but instead released something bound within the crown? The manuscript had warned of corruption, that a soul returning from the shadow realm might not return unchanged. Perhaps the king had been twisted by his imprisonment, or worse perhaps something else entirely had come back in his place. Meanwhile, the kingdom itself began to change. The king issued new laws, harsh and cruel. Taxes doubled. Dissenters were punished with public executions. Entire villages were burned for refusing to obey. The once beloved ruler now ruled with an iron fist. And yet, strangely, his people still followed him. It was as though they could not resist. His presence had grown more powerful, more magnetic. When he spoke, even those who hated him found themselves nodding in agreement. It was not natural, it was as if the crown itself gave him control over their wills. The Queen Mother, once his greatest supporter, grew suspicious. She visited Alaric in secret, demanding the truth. "This is not my son," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What have you brought back to us?" Alaric confessed what he feared, that the king was no longer entirely human, that a darkness had taken root inside him. Tears streamed down her face, but she swore she would not let the shadow consume her family. Plans were made in secret. A handful of loyal knights, the Queen Mother, and Alaric, conspired to confront the king and remove the crown from his head. If the crown was the source of the darkness, perhaps destroying it would free him, or at least end the curse. But such an act was dangerous. The crown was ancient, bound with powers beyond mortal comprehension. To touch it recklessly was to invite death. The night came swiftly. The conspirators gathered in the palace, moving silently through the corridors with torches extinguished. They entered the great hall, where the king sat alone upon his throne, the crown glinting faintly in the moonlight streaming through the stained glass. His head lifted slowly, and his eyes glowed with that dark fire. "You dare betray me?" His voice was deeper now, layered with something inhuman. The knights drew their swords, but before they could advance, shadows erupted from the walls, curling like living smoke. Striking at them with invisible claws, men screamed, their bodies flung across the room. Alaric raised his voice in desperate chants, reciting the words of the ritual backward, hoping to undo what had been done. The king rose from the throne, his body towering, his voice echoing like thunder. "I am no longer your king. I am eternal. I am the crown." The Queen Mother stepped forward, tears on her face. "If you are my son, then hear me. Fight it. Remember who you are." For a moment, the king's face faltered. His eyes flickered, and a glimmer of the man he had been shown through. But then the crown pulsed with light, and the shadow tightened its grip. His hand rose, dark energy crackling at his fingertips. It was then that Alaric acted. With a desperate cry, he leaped forward, seizing the crown from the king's head. The moment his hands touched it, agony consumed him. His flesh burned, his bones shuddered, his soul itself felt as though it was being torn apart. Yet he clung to it, determined to end this curse once and for all. The crown screamed not with sound, but with a voice inside every mind in the room. The stained glass shattered, the ground shook, and the air itself seemed to split apart. Alaric collapsed to his knees, but before the shadows could reclaim him, he drove the crown against the stone floor with all his strength. The golden frame cracked. Jewels burst like shards of fire. And then, in an explosion of light and darkness, the crown shattered. The force threw everyone to the ground. When the smoke cleared, the king lay unconscious on the floor. The crown, nothing more than twisted fragments. The shadows were gone. Silence filled the hall, broken only by the ragged breaths of the survivors. The queen mother rushed to her son's side, cradling him in her arms. His eyes fluttered open, this time clear, human, filled with pain but also with recognition. "Mother," he whispered, his voice weak but his own again. Tears flowed freely as she held him, but Alaric was gone. His body lay lifeless beside the shattered crown, his sacrifice complete. He had given his life to save the king and the kingdom. His name would never be forgotten, though history would tell the story in whispers. Half in awe and half in fear, the king recovered slowly, but he was never the same. His reign continued, yet he carried the scars of what had happened. He ruled with caution, humility, and a haunted look in his eyes. The people still loved him, but they could see the shadow of sorrow that followed him wherever he went. The kingdom prospered again, but the memory of those dark days lingered, a reminder of the dangers hidden within power too great to control. And deep in the archives, in a book bound with dust and time, the story was written, the tale of a king who vanished at his own coronation, and of the crown that nearly devoured him. It became legend, passed from generation to generation, a warning to all who sought power without understanding the price. For though the crown was destroyed, whispers persisted. Some said shards of it still existed, hidden away, waiting to be found, and if they were ever gathered again, the darkness would rise once more. The kingdom was safe for now, but the shadows of history are never gone forever.